King Hussein calls Jazi in the middle of the battle. Jazi mentions this in his own words in the interview. And he says, they want a ceasefire. He simply puts the phone down and continues the battle.
I actually heard that the Egyptian army, at one point, there was nothing between them and Tel Aviv. And they stopped.
You've got a British general leading the Arab defense of Palestine. Something wasn't right. 42 kneecaps in one day. Just put that in Google, it comes up.
Yeah.
About an Israeli sniper talking about how he shot 42 kneecaps in one day. Gaza never lost hope in that objective. And what was the whole reason? Because they felt that the world had forgotten.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi barakatuh. I'm Abdullah Al-Andalusi and I'm here on the Narrative House Unplugged podcast. I'll be interviewing a good guest, Omar Hussein, who is coming to prominence quite recently. He's a khatib, and for the last 10 months he's been writing quite extensively on the issue of Palestine, the plight of the Gazans, him being a Palestinian himself. He been publishing articles on LinkedIn of all places, which was a very interesting platform to actually publish. Most people don't associate articles with LinkedIn. They associate it just with putting their resume or their CV on there. So what got you starting to write articles, as well as also you've been giving some public addresses, for example, at the King's College London Palestine encampment, where students have set up these encampments in England, similar to America, and you've addressed quite a lot of people there, as well as your social media platform itself getting quite a lot of subscribers. So what got you started actually publishing these articles, and why LinkedIn?
Yeah, wa alaikum salam, Abdullah. Jazakallah khair for giving me the opportunity to discuss these issues. Yeah, LinkedIn was a bit of an odd platform to be making these social media posts. However, from my perspective, I had a little bit of a following there, maybe due to work and just kind of general networking. And I decided I could not be silent with regards to what's happening in Gaza. I mean, we were all seeing the photos and videos of children being massacred on a daily basis. And I had to be a voice for them in some way. And I used LinkedIn, given that I felt I could at least get my message out. And it continued to just grow and grow and grow. So it went from a few hundred followers to now well over 7,000. And I really wanted to be a voice for those people in Gaza who were being genocided, essentially killed, slaughtered, displaced. And really that's the reason I chose to use that platform to get my message out.
Okay. Well, I mean, when you were invited to King's College London encampment, was it because of them reading your articles about the Palestine situation, or how did they find you?
Yeah, it's quite interesting actually. Almost every talk or activity I go to, I normally get a comment saying, I've seen your posts on LinkedIn, and I know they're not people who like them. And I think I don't blame them necessarily. I think it's to do with the places of work that they operate within. It may be difficult, but it made me think that actually that message is going out much, much further. So I think it has given a lot of exposure in terms of the political activity that I'm trying to engage in and get the message out there in terms of the situation in Palestine. So yeah, it certainly contributed to, I think, opportunities to address this issue on a local basis at encampments, at masajid, and it's something that I just won't say no to. I won't forgive myself. I remember that grandfather who was talking about his grandchildren dying in front of him, and he said, ask Rasulullah, about the Muslims, about their accountability for leaving us in this situation. So we have to do something to lift that accountability off our necks.
Sure, subhanAllah. And at the King College encampment, what was your address about?
So they asked me to discuss my personal story. Obviously, being from Palestine, I have family there. But I also have a pretty unique story in that my dad, who's now 88 years old, lived through the Nakba. So he was 12 years old. So there isn't many of those around. I think I did a little Googling of that. And I think there's a few thousand left in the world who were old enough to remember the Nakba. Because obviously you might have had a few very young children who wouldn't remember, but he was fully coherent and understood what was happening. So his stories are so insightful in terms of the establishment of the Zionist entity and actually the Nakba itself and the years that followed. So he's got so many gems to share, and through me I try to be that person who can actually take them out to the rest of the world.
SubhanAllah. So for those of you who don't know, I haven't heard it already, the Nakba was a kind of systematic ethnic cleansing of Palestine starting 1947, not 1948, as many of people commonly misconstrue. So after the UN declares a partition of Palestine, giving Palestinians less than 50% of their own land, the Israeli forces, at this point in time, there was no state of Israel, quote unquote, but the Haganah, their so-called defense forces, began clearing operations with the Irgun and Stern, which were declared to be terrorist organizations, and where they cleared out town cities. They used a pretext that there was a shooting somewhere, which is interesting. Like these race riots we have today, use a pretext of a stabbing, which was done by someone that wasn't even Muslim, and they used that to then initiate violence much the same way. And this happened in 1947, and it led to mass expulsion of Palestinians. Some say as much as 700, 800,000 by 1948, 1949. So that's just a general summary of the Nakba. But this brings up a lot of interesting questions. So, where was your father living, and what happened basically? Is in 1947?
Yeah, so he lived in a small village called Kannir, near the city of Haifa. So a very well-known city that sits on the western coast of Palestine, essentially. To the north. And they were a prosperous farming village. So my grandfather had, very large farming lands, very comfortable life. They used to have horses that they used to race on their farmland, and they essentially lived a happy, good life at that time. They had Jewish families nearby in small villages as well, and there used to be a lot of interacting and business trades, and it was a very normal life, you could say, at that point. Obviously, as things progressed and it became very clear that a Zionist state was on the verge of being created, the situation radically changed, and we saw people trying to resist that. So my father recalls the days of resistance when they were trying to protect their village, when they became aware of the Haganah and other similar terrorist organizations which were trying to encroach on these Palestinian villages.
Interesting enough, if you look at the partition plan by the UN, Haifa was actually designated to be an Arab city, not to be part of this new so-called Jewish state, as they called it. And yet that didn't stop, obviously, the Haganah from going there, and the others, Irgun and others, from bombarding it and so on. But some might argue that, and this is the official propaganda, was that they only were clearing towns and villages that were deemed to be active threats to the Jewish state and were attacking Jews, or just a threat in general. Was any truth to that claim made by some Zionist historians?
No, absolutely none at all. I mean, they were clearly trying to force the Palestinians out. So in my father's village, as I mentioned, it was a farming village with a few families. And as news became apparent that they were attacking and massacring Palestinians in other villages, people started to at least come together to form some kind of defense of their villages. So in my dad's village, Kannir, they actually asked the eldest son or one of the sons of each family to arm themselves with a very basic kind of gun to defend their village. And they would put someone out to watch out for them at night. And my dad recalls one night where they actually came to raid the village, and they fired at the people from afar. And they defended the village, and they were able to actually repel that attack. But that was the reality.
So it was at night?
It was at night.
Right.
They came in, they shot. He remembers the story so well. He remembers that there was one man that was kind of designated to bring them tea for those young men who were defending the village. And he got shot, and they realized that this was an impending attack. So my uncle, Hassan, he was one of the defenders of that town or that village. He was a few years older than my father, probably late teens. And they managed to repel that attack. So that was the reality of Palestinians. They were literally trying to protect their homes and their families. Having heard of the horror stories that were occurring in villages across Palestine, it would have been absolute madness not to try and defend your life, your property, your honor. And that's what happened. So I think this was the real situation, one of defending one's right, and not one of Israelis trying to, or those kind of terrorist organizations trying to actually remove a threat in any way.
Yeah, well, you see, I mean, they didn't go to the Haganah. The Haganah came to them, basically.
Exactly.
So they didn't do any operations or attack. And that brings the question, which is, what was the relationship between your father's village that he can remember and just the neighboring like Jewish villages or hamlets or things like this?
Yeah, so it's very interesting, actually. So my father remembers vividly walking in a small Jewish village called Giviat Ada. And he goes, we used to see the Jewish lady doctor there. That was where the kind of local GP was. You could say the equivalent of a GP at that time. And he goes, I recall visiting this Jewish lady doctor and her treating us. He goes, if I was, put back there now, I could remember walking through the streets of Giviat Ada. He remembers a Jewish man that used to come and buy fertilizer and other things for his farmland from a neighboring village. So that was the reality. They actually dealt with Jews in a very normal, harmonious way. So I think you really have to imagine a situation whereby two people were living side by side, and it was only when kind of the advent of these terrorist organizations to take other people's lands that the situation turned into this kind of violent occupation.
I mean, again, just some context for people who wanted to know what's going on in Palestine by this time. So there was obviously a lot of Jewish immigration coming from Europe. Obviously, it's around World War II time, and but for past couple of decades there was Jewish immigration. They were setting up settlements and villages and so on, and a lot of these were very close to Palestinian ones. There wasn't any apartheid at that point in time. You can go anywhere and what have you. And a lot of the time, most of the situation was that these villages and town settlements mostly will just get along with each other because they were built in areas that were either sold or were bought by Jewish colonial banks. And that's what they call themselves, colonial banks, where they'll buy settlements and buy land and what have you. But it was done. This was a kind of usually harmonious situation for the most part. But then it seemed, from that particular account, that this was harmonious. But then there was these external individuals who weren't the neighbors, right? And they were coming in with an idea of nationalism, Jewish nationalism, coming in, and they deemed your father's town to be a threat. So does your father remember the time that his town was conquered, or that or what exactly happened? Was it conquered, attacked? Did he leave before finding out what would happen based on reports of massacres happening elsewhere? What was exact circumstances behind your father leaving the town?
Yeah, no, I'll come to that. Actually, just an important point that you mentioned regarding, I think, what was happening in terms of politically in Palestine. As you say, the immigration had increased to such an extent that obviously now there was potentially this fear of encroaching. And we know that under the British mandate, the police force there was primarily Jewish. And there's many historians who've talked about the fact that large numbers of Jews entered the police force and became the predominant element within the local police force. So many Arabs started to resist. And so it was not strange that the two things were quite distinct. The villages that were living nearby in terms of their relationship on a personal level was absolutely fine, but they could see the bigger political game playing out. So my grandfather himself was arrested by the British, and he was imprisoned for some time for being part of the resistance against the occupation and the future plans in terms of, because everyone knew about the Balfour Declaration 30 years earlier. So it was no surprise that there was a political plan to try and displace them. But I think that they never saw that in terms of their relationships on a personal level, but they definitely saw the risk of these organizations who had now become armed and strong and powerful from encroaching on their own villages and towns. In terms of what happened with my father, just to come to your question, so my grandfather took the decision.
Well, I think before we get to that, should we just perhaps lay some context down again? Because I always like to assume the audience knows absolutely nothing about the topic, and sometimes the mistake is we speak on things with assumed knowledge. So just to give everybody again more context. So the British obviously took over Palestine from the Ottomans, and they're the one that implemented increased Jewish immigration into Palestine from Europe and elsewhere. Prior to that, the Ottomans did allow Jewish immigration, but England opened the floodgates with the idea of creating a quote-unquote national home for the Jews in Palestine without talking about what the native population want or what they're going to do or what have you. And under this regime, the British regime worked with the Jewish Agency, which was a kind of quasi-semi-governmental group for Jews, but there was no equivalent for the Palestinians that was recognized by the British government. So the British government, in essence, just didn't recognize any political organization for the Palestinians, and clearly the Palestinians were kind of excluded out from the administration of Palestine, which included the police forces, but recognized the Jewish Agency as an official organization that the British government would work with for the development of Palestine, to achieve the goal of the Balfour Declaration of creating a national home for Jews, which would at some point mean an independent state based on the Jewish ethnicity, but nothing was mentioned about the Palestinians. So this was what was going on, and there was land being bought up, and it was usually going one way. So if any Palestinian wants to sell their land, it would be bought up by a proxy or by others, and it would go then to Jewish settlement for farming, what have you. But if any Jewish person wants to sell their land, it would not be on the open market for Palestinians to buy. So it was one way, much like what the French did in Algeria. So this was what was happening there. Obviously, some state land, which was not owned by anybody, it was going to be for everybody's benefit, was being sold privately for Jewish settlements. So clearly, it wasn't a fair system for the Palestinians, because there was this project to obviously allow full settlement by people coming from Europe, in essence. So this was the context for everyone that wants to know. So, and the British clearly was clamped down upon Arab resistance movements or Palestinian resistance movements, and they would arrest and so on and so forth. And this was usually how it operated. The administration was heavily slanted and biased. Indeed, some of the governors of the Mandate of Palestine were actually open Zionists themselves. So this clearly didn't create a fair and equal environment for the Palestinians. So this is just so you understand some of the general context before we go into a dive into the particulars, so we can situate it. Okay, yeah. So what happened? So obviously this was a situation. So what happened then? Obviously now the UN. So Britain tries to placate everybody, doesn't want to upset the Arabs in the Middle East because it has some of its client regimes are obviously Arabs, and they are complaining their populations are upset and angry about what's happening to their Palestinian brothers, and at the same time they don't want to renege on their promise to the Zionist organization, which will later be called the World Zionist Organization. And so they just said, look, you know what? What can we do to not be blamed? Let's just give it to the UN. Let them vote for the solution or whatever they want to do, maybe a partition or what have you, so we don't have to be blamed. So that was the situation. The UN declares a partition. The Zionist organization, the Jewish Agency, and the Haganah, others begin military campaigns to grab as much land as they possibly can, and begin ethnic cleansing operations. Google Plan Dalet as well, for those of you who want to know. So they would have a policy to go to different towns and villages, and then assess if they are a threat, and then basically to expel and destroy them. So in that kind of milieu that was happening politically, what did your father tell you about what he remembers was the time that his town fell?
My grandfather was fully aware that villages and towns had been attacked by the terrorist forces that were operating in that region. And therefore, he took the difficult decision to leave his village, and they became refugees, internally displaced refugees, essentially in the West Bank, near the city of Jenin. So it wasn't that they actually encountered the occupation of their village. They took the decision based on the reports that were circulating at the time, which were verified reports of the massacre in Dar Yassin, Tantura, and other places, that it would be safer to protect their family by leaving. And you can imagine they had young children, women, and they didn't have any real means of protection.
Is he saying that basically they heard these reports of these were massacres that did occur, and they've been widely corroborated massacres, that they didn't want to just roll the dice and wait to see if their women and children would be treated leniently along with them, depending on the temperament of the person, that the commander that comes with their forces to do ethnic cleansing, basically. So the question is then, so they thought, okay, we'll leave because we don't want to see what happens to us. We don't want to be the next Dir Yassin. So where did they go? What did they do? And what rough time period was this? So what was like, what year exactly? What was it, 1947, the end of 1947, or was it the 1948, beginning of 1948?
It was in 1948, I believe, probably very close to the time of the official Nakba date. I think it's whatever it is, May, around that time they left. I would say that from their perspective, they thought they were going to come back. So most of these displaced families did not think this was a permanent move. They believed that this was just a temporary move. The Arab armies would come, they would liberate Palestine, and they would come back. So famously, they used to take their keys with them, and they used to leave the house as if, we're coming back here. So that was obviously something that they held on to in the initial years.
Were they told to leave by some supposed Arab radio broadcast by the Arab countries?
I believe there were radio broadcasts that mentioned the massacres. I'm not sure if there was an official kind of encouragement or notification to leave. However, that my grandfather at the time and many of the people in that village took the decision it was safer to vacate and to find safe passage elsewhere. So they moved to the West Bank, or current day West Bank, the city of Jenin.
So they went to the modern day West Bank. So what was the situation of, like, why did they pick Jenin? So they were presumably then going on the roads they could. Was the road safe for them to go? And where did they? What was the factors that they were thinking about that made them eventually end up in Jenin?
So Jenin famously was defended by the Iraqi army. So they achieved a famous victory against the Haganah there, actually under the command of General Omar Ali Bayraktar, a famous Iraqi general. And that protected actually the West Bank, because Jenin was an entry point into the West Bank. So towns like Tulkarem would come after it. So that became known as a place where they could essentially congregate under safe passage, under the protection of an official army. So I believe that was the main motivation for them moving there. And the Iraqi army also had some resources and ability to look after people that had become internally displaced.
Sure. And so then, so they went to Jenin thinking it was a safe space for them to go, a safe area they can seek refuge. So then, once what was the kind of challenge they faced, because they were uprooted from their village. I mean, they couldn't take the furniture, they couldn't take many things. They presumably, I can only suppose they took what they could carry. As much as
that's right. I mean, from a prosperous village where they were living quite a comfortable life, they ended up actually living the initial months in a cave.
Wow.
They had no tents. They had nothing at that time.
So this is near Jenin.
This is near Jenin.
This cave. Okay.
The Jenin district, you can call it, or the area of Jenin, essentially, not just the city. Essentially, they lived in a cave, and they were picking kind of like wild herbs and trying to sell them. They ate grass, so things like we see in Gaza, they literally got to that situation in the initial months. Wow. Until there was a more kind of formal approach to managing the refugees there. And then I think for about a couple of years they lived in more kind of substantial tents and other kind of amenities that were provided by those who were kind of organizing the relief work for the refugees.
Okay, so I want to just cycle back a bit. So obviously this is now, ceasefire is declared for 48 to 49 ceasefire agreements, and you see the West Bank being controlled by Jordan. Jordan claims the West Bank, and Egypt takes Gaza. But before we go further, I wanted to kind of just pick apart that some people might say that Palestinian resistance to the British occupation and the British promoted project of a quote unquote national home for a Jewish state, that the Palestinians were unreasonable perhaps for resisting. Maybe they should have just, if they didn't resist, there would have been no consequences that came later. So what was life like before the UN partition for the Palestinians? You did mention that there was some mistreatment, some obviously at the hands of it seemed to imply an institutionally racist police force, because many of these people that were coming in the police forces were Jewish European immigrants who had ideas of Zionism and so on. But so, what was your source for this, and what kind of evidences do you put forward to kind of verify that?
Yeah, so there's an interesting quote that I managed to retrieve from a paper that was written in 2011. It was called Securing Zion, Policing in British Palestine, 1917 to 39, by Professor John Knight. And he discusses the composition of Jews in the Palestine police force. And he states, the majority of these Jewish forces were supposedly for defensive purposes. Regardless, they were all members of the semi-secret underground Jewish army, the Haganah. The British were well aware of this and tacitly approved. In doing so, the British made a significant contribution to the Zionist project. So we already know about the Balfour Declaration. We already know about a homeland for Jews. And now we see a direct policy to ensure that they strengthen those Jewish forces in Palestine. The Arabs were becoming fully aware of this and trying to mount some kind of defense. So you did find many Arabs trying to resist this occupation or this planned occupation of Palestine. So I think that's really the backdrop. They were fully aware about what was happening. They knew that the partition plan was hugely unfair. I mean, I think it was 56% to be given to the Jewish population when they made up about a third of the population.
A third of the population, yeah.
And roughly the remaining 45% or so to be given to 2/3. It was exactly the opposite in terms of what the numbers should have been if it was a fair distribution of land. So we can see that it was never intended to bring a kind of a practical solution. It's the same kind of arguments we see about Gaza. If they don't resist, there will be no problems. But they've been killing people in Gaza. They've been preventing supplies from going in for over 2 decades. So I think it's really important to understand the context. It was definitely a one-sided occupation which was trying to strengthen the hand of those future terrorist organizations.
Sure. So, I mean, from what I read of the statistics, so at the beginning of the British occupation of Palestine, Jews were roughly around 6% of the population. Many of them were immigrants that came in under the Ottoman rule, and that was fine. You come in officially, that's fine as immigrants. You get approved, no problem. But then there's obviously it gets taken over by this foreign power, the British Empire, and then by the time of the UN declared partition, 1947, 1/3 of the population of Palestine is Jewish Europeans. I like to mention very specifically Europeans because they're Europeans who happen to be Jewish as opposed to they're then somehow not Europe, because they are Europeans. In fact, it would be racist to say they're not Europeans. To exclude them because they at least have a significant ancestry for 1,800 years, which is a long time in Europe. Yeah. That's why they look European, intermarriage amongst Europeans. So you had these people, they're speaking German, they're speaking Russian, Polish, so these various languages, and they were coming in, some French. And so it seems to me the picture you're kind of obviously painting is that, and plus what I've also obviously read on the matter is that you had this British administration of Palestine. It was giving preference to selling land to these to Jewish Europeans, and not so to the Palestinians equally. It recognized a representative Jewish organization called the Jewish Agency, which was representing the Jews living in Palestine. But there was no equivalent recognition of anything that represents the Palestinians or their beliefs or their desires or anything like this. And then added to all that, you had a local police force. The British were using a local police force, which was formed majoritarily of a minority that was coming in from Europe, and the rest of it just being British English policemen as well, who were also from Europe, of course. So almost an exclusively European police force on these Palestinians. So of course, then once you put into that, see that full picture. Obviously, the Palestinians. Would it be fair to say that they felt excluded, not represented by the administration, not taken seriously, while their country was being forcefully changed around them by these foreigners that came in?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's exactly the situation that we're encountering. And I think that's one of the reasons why they weren't going to wait around to see what happens. If you've heard of those horror stories in villages and towns throughout Palestine, the last thing you're going to do is risk your own family and their safety and well-being. And they weren't armed. I mean, we're talking about at the very best lightly armed guns, against, in many cases, armed units who had vehicles and grenades and other weaponry that was much more advanced than them. So they obviously took that difficult decision that it was better to find sanctuary under the protection of a kind of an official army, which they became aware about in Jenin under the Iraqi army, than to potentially face their own massacre at the hands of those terrorist organizations.
And where were these weapons that the Palestinians were using? These villages, townspeople. What was the origin of these weapons? Were they being supplied with the Arab world, quote unquote, or the Muslim world, sending tons of armaments in to help their Palestinian brothers arm themselves up to defend themselves?
I think it was more kind of a loose network of people who were trying to resist. So you had people from Syria, people buying from the French in Syria, I understand at the time. You had obviously some resistance movements that had started to become, quite prominent in Palestine, and they were the ones who were trying to organize this defense. But it was a completely outnumbered, outgunned defense, really, of the land. So my grandfather himself wasn't involved in things like that, but he was involved in trying to organize and protect and give money and help these people maybe move from place to place. And they would raid. They raided Conneer twice, the British, actually, under my dad's time. He remembers them raiding the village twice. They'd come in, they would turn the house upside down, looking for weapons, looking for anything they could. And my grandfather was, arrested initially for a short period of time. So it was quite common. You did see the initial kind of beginnings of a resistance movement, but it was one that really had no chance against what it was about to face.
So the Palestinians were, you could say, defanged of any weapons that they could use to defend themselves, approaching the 1947 Nakba catastrophe. They were just, the British left them even more vulnerable and scattered.
Exactly.
And so they had no hope against the organized Haganah forces that would come later. Okay, I mean that's very important for people to understand the context. The Palestinians were disorganized because of a number of situations. Plus, they had no idea of how to. They've had no history of organizing against a common invader. Usually, the Ottomans would protect them and so on. And now they were left completely vulnerable. Okay, so we get to the situation where your family is in Jenin, and they were initially, it was an area that the Iraqi army came in. So these Arab armies came in to Palestine in 1948. They said ostensibly that they were there to protect the Palestinians. They were coming in. They didn't say anything they're going to wipe out Jews or kill all Jews or any of that kind of stuff. But what they said to the UN was, there are massacres happening in Palestine. We're going to come and defend. Do you think that these Arab states, many of them newly independent, Iraq and Syria and Egypt and so on. Jordan was a bit independent a bit more earlier, but do you think that they did try their best to help the Palestinians? They tried their best against the Haganah to defend the areas that were going to be given to the Arab partition, and that they really did try to rescue Palestinians and enable their right to return back to their towns and villages in safety?
Yeah, so I think if we look at the makeup of the armies, actually, they were primarily under the Jordanian army, and that was under the command of General Glubb, a British general. So let's just think about this for a second. You've got a British general leading the Arab defense of Palestine against the people that they had already guaranteed or promised this land as a land or homeland for Jews. Something wasn't right. And many people realized that early on. So you had incidents where people realized that. And one of the most famous was the example of Omar Ali Bayraktar. So this is a general from Iraq who mounted a genuine defense of Jenin and defeated the Haganah there. And what was very interesting is he actually said, let me go on and liberate Haifa. I mean, if you see the map of Palestine, it's a very small country. Mm-hmm. Palestine has no strategic depth, by the way. No one can really protect it. It's about 110 miles, I think, if I'm at the widest point. If you consider Jenin to Haifa, it's probably half that distance. It's very short. So edge of the West Bank to the west coast of Palestine. So what happened is he was now wanting to mount an attack against Haifa and liberate it. This would have split Palestine into half and almost made the Jewish presence there very weak in terms of their military units. So he was given a command by the Iraqi minister, Saleh Zaki, not to go further. And Palestinian women used to sing a folk song about this. And they would go, Shlono Saleh Zaki, Maku Amar, Maku Amar. What is wrong with you, Saleh Zaki? Do you not give the order? And the order means to fight. And it became a popular song amongst Palestinian women. So they realized at that time, the Palestinians, actually, this was something that could have been ended very quickly, this occupation. But unfortunately, his order did not come, and they remained there for about 2 years, protecting the local population.
So you had an Iraqi general that was willing to go all the way to Haifa. And might I add that Haifa was actually, according to the UN partition plan, was actually meant to go to the Arab state, to the Arabs, quote unquote. So it was actually meant to be a part that the Zionists were not entitled to. They took it anyway, right? Bombarded it and forced the population to flee while the British were watching it, actually. So he wanted to go and rescue Haifa, but he was yanked back by the supplies being cut, because obviously the army doesn't have infinite bullets, infinite food. It depends on supplies coming from its host country and Jordan, presumably. So it was cut. Its supplies were cut if it wanted to go any further. Right. To rescue Haifa. And what would you say about the Jordanians? Do you think that the Jordanians had a serious intent to rescue the Palestinians throughout Palestine from being kicked out of their homes and from being massacred and so on and so forth? Do you think that they did that? Or the Egyptians either?
No, they clearly didn't. And there was a really good example that came from an officer actually in the Jordanian army that would rise to become a general, and his name was Mashur Hadith al-Jazi, and he fought in 1948 as a junior officer, and actually he was very frustrated by what happened in 1948, and he saw it as the selling of Palestine to essentially these Jewish terrorist forces. So what was very clear is that the British had no intention to take back Palestine. And there are many examples. So there was a land that they had taken from the West Bank that it's called, I think it's something called the Triangle. It basically covers the edge of the West Bank to about halfway through to Tel Aviv, modern day Tel Aviv. And they actually gave that back, even though the Jordanian forces were in control. So if you now think about a map of Palestine, you have the West Bank going just a few miles off the coast of Tel Aviv under Jordanian control. But the king at the time actually surrendered that land. So it was to exacerbate the problems of the Palestinians now, where even land that they had managed to to hold was now being handed back. And Egypt did something very similar, where it was actually from the Gaza Strip much further north that they had actually initially won in battle, and they handed that back and they left only the Gaza Strip. So these were clear intentions not to actually defend Palestine. There was no intention to actually defeat this, the impending creation of this Zionist entity.
I actually heard that the Egyptian army at one point had broken through to the point where there was nothing between them and Tel Aviv, right, the capital of the state today called Israel, and they stopped and waited for about a week, and then the Haganah forces came. And then obviously made that defense, but they waited. There was nothing in between them and Tel Aviv, basically, and they stopped. So I heard this. I also heard in the memoirs of the Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir that there was negotiations between her and King Abdullah of Jordan before the war began, where he gave some assurances that no, I'm not going to take all the areas that were given for the Jewish partition of it. I just want the West Bank, basically, if you want to take it that. But if ever it comes about that, let's say if they do lose, whatever, I'll give you an autonomous area for you. But I just want the West Bank, basically. And that was their arrangement, their agreement. It was in her diaries, basically. So, she wasn't really lying about her personal diaries that she didn't intend to publish later on, right? Yeah. And, so, okay. So then, of course, and there's other things which I also noticed, which was, and I think people should just Google it for themselves as well. The size of the Arab armies was actually much less than the Haganah and Irgun and others at the beginning of the war and at the end, right? So the beginning of the war, they were outnumbered 2-1 by the Haganah forces. So basically, these Arab armies were actually weaker than their opponents in terms of size. This actually not like hard to find. You can just even on Wikipedia mentions it as well. Like just you see the size of the sword, like, oh, really? I was led to believe it was this Goliath. This is Goliath versus little David, as they say. I think I think an Israeli historian said it was more like David versus other Davids or something like this. In this case, an even smaller David. So they were already outnumbered by the Haganah, who had a much larger trained army force, and by the end of it, they was outnumbered almost 3-1. So the Arab armies came in were actually in the minority in terms of the fighting force. But anyway, okay, so that was 1948. So now if we cycle forward to the 1960s now, and obviously 1967, the Naksa happens, right? Yeah. Which is where the state of Israel initiates military conflict. Like no one started bombing the state of Israel prior to this. No one attacked, no one invaded. They called a preemptive strike. Every strike they do is preemptive. It seems today they was saying, this was preemptive. So they did a preemptive strike, as they quote unquote they call it, and they began attacking Egypt. And they then took the Golan Heights from Syria, and they took the West Bank from Jordan. So, what was your family's recollection of this time in 1967, or around about that time? I know there was some say there was a preceding incident in 1966 where the Israeli army raided into Jordan and destroyed some villages, alleging that they planted a mine on the other side. They use it as a pretext, and even America complained, saying that this shows the Arabs that even if you do nothing to the Israelis and you try to have a peace with them, they still attack you, right? So that led Gamal Abdel Nasser to saber rattle and just put some token forces on the border with Israel and say don't do this. And also he was worried that he had a report from the Soviets that Israel was about to invade Syria, right? So, but it was a small army. It was not, and they were waiting there for weeks on end. No invasion, nothing. So Israel just says, we feel threatened, so we're going to start conquering. So, what was your family's recollection of the Israeli invasion of the West Bank? So they'd moved to Jenin for safety. Then they realized, actually, no. That perhaps a more fundamental question is, did your family, after the ceasefire was agreed, did they ever try to go back to their village and town? What was their experience? Before we go to 1967, did they ever try to go back or make an application to go back and be citizens of the state of Israel?
They didn't, no. I wouldn't be aware of what exactly happened at that time in terms of the discussions, but I don't think they felt there was a credible way of returning to their village. In fact, their village was destroyed. So they destroyed the houses, they destroyed infrastructure in that village. So that they became aware of that anyway. So
there was no home to go back to.
There was no home to go back to in any case. They still obviously believed that they have a right to return to that land, but it wasn't something that they felt they could do. And given the stories of what had occurred in the previous years, I don't think anyone would have felt safe to return to a land under occupation, essentially. So no, they didn't. They didn't return to those lands.
Sure. And for more context. So the lands that was meant to be given to, the state of Israel, quote unquote, all the lands that it took, including lands that was actually meant to go to the Arabs, the population that was calculated, actually, so the UN partition was 40%. So the Arabs were 40% of the population initially in the lands that were to be partitioned to the Jewish state by the UN. Ben Gurion famously complained that how can you have a viable democratic Jewish state if 40% of the population are not Jews or Arabs? If only this could be solved somehow. And then his commanders understood from that. Many historians have said his commanders understood from that. Okay, we get what you're trying to say, and they reduced down the population to 10%. So from 3/4 of Palestinians were evicted or killed in various ways, I might add, from that land and so on. And then the remaining 10% were deemed to be a controllable population, and they were under military rule. So they were not allowed freedom until 1967, when Israel took over new land and had new Palestinians for military rule. So could you then describe what your father has told you was his experience and his family's experience of, okay, they tried to escape from Israel because they feared for their lives, and yet Israel still came for them. They still came to the West Bank, followed them, and took over Jenin. So what was his experience of that? What did they do? How did they react? And what was going on?
Yeah, so just to say, they actually left Jenin a couple of years later.
Right.
And resettled in Nur Shams, which is a refugee camp next to Tulkarem.
Okay.
So that was a couple of years after their original kind of move from Kanir to the West Bank. So from there, they had kind of settled and tried to start building up a life. Obviously, very little in terms of means. They were all kind of one huge family into one room. It was a kind of a typical situation for most Palestinians at that time. Now, 1967, the feeling at the time was this was a betrayal of the Palestinians in the West Bank. And I have an uncle who was actually an officer in the Jordanian army, and they all say there was no real defense of the West Bank. And if you look at even the numbers, when defending a land, you usually take heavy casualties as a military force. But the casualties were not even that high in the Jordanian army. We're talking probably low hundreds defending the whole of the West Bank, which is a sizable area. That actually did strategic withdrawals until they essentially left the West Bank to be fully occupied by the Israeli forces. So the feeling was that this was a complete betrayal of the Palestinians, and the West Bank was actually handed over. And the same feeling is believed in the Golan Heights, where there were reports that people said that the reports of the kind of retreat had already been given before they left their posts, i.e. it had already been agreed by the regime at the time that they were going to leave the Golan Heights to be occupied. And we have to remember, these are agent rulers. They weren't there to protect the Palestinians. They weren't even there to protect their own sovereignty. And I think that's important. And just to go back to that general I mentioned, Jazi, he actually fought in the 67 war, and he was extremely frustrated by the loss of land. And he then actually fought the Israelis himself in 1968, which is a very, very interesting story of what happens when you don't work under those client rulers and you take a decision to fight independently, essentially, of these plots and plans.
Okay, but what was your family's recollection of the loss of, obviously, Jordan's rule over the West Bank? And, I mean, firstly, how were they treated by the Jordanians? Because people argue that, well, the Palestinians shouldn't be given their own state because they didn't seem to care if the Jordanians ruled them instead. So how was life like for them? At least, okay, I know they were obviously in a state of poverty after losing, their possessions and everything, and forcing to be refugees. But how was life like in Jordan, under Jordan-controlled West Bank, compared to Israeli-controlled West Bank afterwards?
I mean, at the end of the day, these people still share the same belief. They share the same culture. So yes, it's incomparable to Israeli occupation, which raids homes in the middle of the night and abducts people and kills children and arrests women. I mean, we can't compare the two. Essentially, Jordan was there, made up, probably now 50-50 in terms of the population, at least Jordanians and Palestinians. And these people shared the same belief that they were Muslims, they had the same culture, the same values. So there was certainly not animosity in that respect. But yes, it was more about the fact that they had been dispossessed of their lands and their wealth and their, what they would consider home, not a refugee camp. They lived, for example, my family, in a British prison. So Nur Shams was an old British prison. The whole area was a British prison. So even when I used to go and visit, even till the 90s, they hadn't even changed the kind of cells. So you could see the metal bars and the cells in the house. Wow. They were still that. And then when they built up, it was kind of like modern flats as the years progressed. But initially, when they lived in the original house, it was part of the British prison. So you could literally see the bars on the windows. So, you've gone from a place where you lived on prosperous farming land and ate off the fat of the land and everything else, riding your horses and going to the coast of Palestine, and now you're living in a converted British prison, 10 people to a room. So yeah, I think the frustration was much more about what had been lost as opposed to being under Jordanian authority.
So you're saying under Jordanian authority, basically, there was no, because Jordanians and Palestinians, I mean, obviously these are a distinction that the British created by just creating the state of Jordan, which was used to be ironically also called the Mandate of Palestine as well, before they just said, oh, we'll separate it out and call it Jordan now. So in essence, there was no differences between them to actually warrant any discrimination in the first place, because they're effectively, the similarities is just, and the fact there's a large number of Palestinians already sought refuge in Jordan proper, and so there was already a big makeup. Some people say today that the majority of current day Jordan are the people are Palestinians to this day.
That's probably the case, yeah.
Okay, so that's 1967. So you mentioned something about in 1968. So this wasn't known as anything as a major war per se, but you mentioned about a famous individual fighting the Israelis in 1968, that general. So tell me about this. What is this situation? What is this context?
Yeah, so I think the Zionist entity relies on ensuring that Muslims and those local populations feel defeated and weak and incapable. So you won't hear the story of Jenin 1948 and Karama 1968 because they don't fit that narrative. They fit a narrative of victory and strength. So what happened in 1968 is Israelis decided they wanted to raid a camp in Karama, right at the border of Jordan. So this was a PLO
So
camp.
this is not the West Bank. This is
No,
Jordan.
this is Jordan proper.
The modern day Jordan.
Modern day Jordan,
yeah.
So they're raiding Karama. Karama has a PLO camp, and they were undertaking operations against the Israelis from all accounts. So King Hussein essentially does not want to get involved in this battle. But he has a general under his command who has other ideas. So this General Jazi, this does something that's completely unbelievable in terms of Arab armies. He breaks the command or breaks communication with Amman. And the story is amazing because he tells it in his own words. This is an interview that he did with Al Jazeera.
So am I getting correctly that so the Israelis want to raid into Jordan to take out this a Palestinian refugee camp where there's PLO.
It's a PLO camp.
A PLO camp, right?
Yeah.
And am I getting it correctly that the Jordanians basically seem like they had an agreement with Israel saying, okay, we'll let you come into our own territory, and just take out this PLO camp, basically. We're not going to oppose you in this. But this general has other ideas.
He has other ideas.
Okay.
So the story is amazing. He tells it in his own words. So he prepares his soldiers and officers. And what he does actually is quite amazing. This is mentioned in a documentary where he gets all his officers to take an oath on the Quran.
Really?
He takes an oath on the Quran, and they say, look, you fight to victory or death. We're not repeating 67, he says to them. He had a big issue with 67. He knew it was a surrender of the West Bank. So he takes his decision. He prays Salat al-Fajr, and he makes a dua to Allah. This is all mentioned in his interview. He says, oh Allah, these people are trying to take our haqq, and we're trying to defend our haqq. Let the haqq defeat the batil. He says that in the interview, and then he basically gives the instruction that as the Israelis are crossing on the bridge into the proper Jordan proper, if you want to call it that.
Crossing over the River Jordan, yeah.
Yeah, they're crossing over, and he tells them open fire. And now this was not a command from Amman. Amman was said, keep out of this. So he also asks his officers to be out right at the front of the battle. He goes, I don't want you fighting from afar. You're with the soldiers and you're fighting, defending this land.
Right.
Now, he also says something very important. And this shows you to the extent to which Hussein was willing to sell out. Jordan oversees Palestine. So Jordan has a very high land over Palestine. And one of those areas is As-Salt. As-Salt was the old capital of Jordan many years ago. And he knew that if they entered, they could take As-Salt. If they took As-Salt, they can go to Amman. There is no defense left of Jordan. It's completely exposed now. Jordan as a country is exposed to a Zionist occupation. The whole of Jordan could have fallen under their control. So he realizes the stakes are high. And now he decides to mount this defense. In the battle, he is now repelling the Zionist forces. By the way, they bring in 30,000 troops. It's a huge invasion.
Wow.
Way outnumbered in terms of the Jordanian forces, outnumbering them significantly. So they fight essentially a ground offensive initially. And the Israelis realize this isn't actually a walk in the park. There's something not gone to plan here. Mm-hmm. So they bring in the Air Force. Jordan has no Air Force at this time whatsoever. Mm-hmm. Cannot mount a single kind of aerial defense of Jordan. So they are taking heavy bombing, like a bombing campaign. And at one point, Jazi says, I think I've caused the destruction of the Jordanian army. But then, subhanAllah, he starts asking, what are the losses? What are the losses? And they go, nothing. One shaheed here, a few injuries here. We're alhamdulillah, we've kept all our positions. At this point, Israel realizes this battle is completely going out of control for them. King Hussein calls Jazi in the middle of the battle. Jazi mentions this in his own words in the interview. And he says, they want a ceasefire. He simply puts the phone down and continues the battle. And it's considered, a huge victory. Reports indicate that the Israelis maybe took over 1,000 casualties in terms of dead and wounded. Many vehicles were destroyed, and they had to actually even negotiate returning the bodies of the slain soldiers. But given that the fact they were hugely outnumbered, outgunned, had no air force, the fact that they were able to defend Jordan and force the Israelis to withdraw was considered a huge victory. And karama also means honor. So even in Jordan to this day, they say, where is the karama of the Battle of Karama? The Jordanian tribes, not Palestinians. This is another interesting thing, because there's a lot of disunity that occurs when people try to claim it's a Jordanian versus a Palestinian, or Palestinian versus a Jordanian. And in fact, the Jordanian tribes used to say, where is the karama of the Battle of Karama? Where is the honor of the Battle of Karama? So it was really a famous victory.
So this was, you saw this on an interview that general gave. Was it, where was this interview?
Al Jazeera.
On Al Jazeera.
Late 90s, yeah.
Late 90s,
yeah.
Wow. So would you say then it seemed like there was a lot of individuals at the time, Muslims who took their deen seriously, and they took defending the honor and the blood of the Muslims seriously, against people that were threatening these, and that were wanting to take land and wanting to conquer. Do you think that sentiment still exists in the Muslim armies today amongst soldiers and commanders, or do you think the Muslim armies today have been thoroughly secularized by the regimes over, for like 50, 60 years later now?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. I think their objective is exactly that, to secularize and kind of take away that feeling of victory and supporting your fellow Muslim. But it still exists. I'll give a recent example. In the Arab world, there's a current retired general who does lots of interviews with Al Jazeera. His name is Duwairi. And this Duwairi has become a household name across the Arab world. So he analyzes the resistance in Gaza. So he talks about their operations. He talks about how they've managed to kind of continue to hold land despite the overwhelming numbers of the Israeli army and their military prowess, that they've still continued to resist. So Duwairi recently, or some time ago, he said in an interview that, don't tell me that any Palestinian has more right to Al-Quds than me. No one has more right to Al-Quds than me. I'm Jordanian. That doesn't detract from my responsibility to this land. That does not detract from my responsibility to the land of Palestine. And actually that view is held by many. But unfortunately, when the political system there is to prevent such people from actually assisting their fellow Muslims in Palestine, you don't see that. So that's just an example of Duwairi. And Duwairi actually became such a threat because he was creating this feeling that actually maybe we can do something. Maybe the resistance is capable, i.e., what about if armies were to move? He made a statement, actually, which was very interesting. He said, we were told a lie all these years, that this Zionist enemy is invincible. It seems that they're far from invincible. That statement coming out of a retired general sent shockwaves, actually. And Blinken, apparently, and this is something that Duwairi mentions in an interview, he said Blinken had spoken to Al Jazeera directly and said, shut this man up. He is creating a feeling amongst the Muslims that there is victory. And he mentioned many times in his tweets, the victory will come, the victory will come. This is not your average person. This was the head of the Irbid artillery school or something in Jordan. He has a very high position and his words were carrying weight. So that's just an indication. But there's many other examples I could give. In my own personal interactions, I've had many retired officers from Bangladesh, from Pakistan, from Egypt. I've had active people commenting on my posts from Malaysia, from Jordan, from Egypt, saying, where are the Ummah? We want to support. In fact, I had a beautiful story from a Malaysian soldier. I do this thing where I tag in the armed forces. You can tag them in on LinkedIn, like the Jordan Armed Forces, and whoever works there might see them, these posts. And then a Malaysian officer or soldier commented on one of my posts. He goes, "What's wrong with asking on the Malaysians to also support Palestine? Why did you not tag us in? Don't we have a responsibility to this ummah?" I thought that's the sincerity of this ummah. So these are officers, these are soldiers, these are not your average person. But the reality is, when you're under a political system which ensures these people do not act outside the remit that has been set for them by their agent rulers, then unfortunately that just does not transpire into action. But the willingness, the feeling, I have 100% no doubt that tomorrow, if a change in political system happened, you would find these armies being at the forefront of any kind of battle to liberate Palestine. Okay.
I want to cycle back to that a bit later because you opened up a very interesting point. But before we get to that, I would like to then, in what we've been discussing, just like fast forward now from obviously your family's experience in 1947, 1948, 1967, now coming under Israeli control, Israeli military rule. And you touched upon a few things about, raids at night, children being killed for just simply throwing a stone, or even just for being suspected of throwing a stone or having a weapon on them, or even just shot and a justification given afterwards for whatever, depending on the mood of the soldier. So I want to get to the situation now. So we know a lot about what's happening in Gaza, not always from mainstream media, but from social media.
Yeah.
And before I touched upon that, because of course we've already many of us have seen the very harrowing images, very well, they defy words, to see the constant stream of dead bodies. Most of them appear to be children, and of course, Gaza was never, even after the so-called Israeli disengagement, 2002 and 2003, it was never free. It was never given independence. It never could control its own borders or even go fishing to get fish beyond just very close to the coast. And they had this big, massive wall that had guard towers, reminiscent of a prison camp. Because the only thing that I've seen a wall and guard towers on is a prison camp. I haven't seen it elsewhere. One could say a camp for concentrating civilians. What name? Wonder if there's a name exists for that. Okay, but I think what people don't realize is that since October the 7th, there's been an increased persecution of Palestinians also in the West Bank. And before I get to that, I want to just get to what the normal life was, if you can call it normal, or what it was for Palestinians in the West Bank was before October the 7th, and then ask what happened after October 7th. What was that? Because West Bank is not ruled over by Hamas. As far as we're aware, the Palestinian Authority, controlled by formerly the PLO, they're the ones that have been given, since Oslo Accords, administrative control over area A and B. They security control supposedly their own independent autonomous area A, and B, Israel retains security control, usually areas between these different blocks, these different Palestinian blocks. To travel from one block to the other, they have to go through Israeli security. And then 60% of the West Bank is Area C, complete control by the Israeli military. So that was the overall political situation. You've presumably obviously been to the West Bank before October 7th. So can you describe to me what life is like for Palestinians, where your family resides in which area?
Still in the West Bank in Nur Shams, near Tulkarem. That's primarily where we have some family near Jenin as well, in a village there. So that's the main two areas that they reside in.
So that's Area A, basically, where...
It's actually Area B.
It's Area B.
It's Area B.
Okay.
Tulkarem falls under Area B. But you know what, to be honest, Area A, B and C get raided equally. So for most Palestinians, it means very little. Nur Shams has not only been raided so many times, it's been destroyed in terms of they destroyed the roads. They bring in bulldozers, they destroy the roads, they destroy houses, they destroy shops, the water supply, electricity, anything to kind of, this is post-September 11th. 7th of October, sorry.
Sure. But let's start with pre,
yeah.
Just to give that understanding of of what life was like before October 7th and how it got worse, basically. So before October the 7th, what was life like for Palestinians in the West Bank, the area that's, the PLA famously made its peace agreement. They renounced violence and renounced resistance against the state of Israel. So what were the Palestinians being treated like in what was meant to be the area of peace that after a peace agreement the Oslo Accords was signed? What was the life of the Palestinian under supposed some degree of autonomy given, some, although most of it continued military occupation, but military rule, shall we say, because it's all military occupation. But
so I think an interesting fact that has become pretty common knowledge really is that actually prior to the 7th of October, the number of Palestinians killed in the West Bank had been one of the highest on record for many years, and many of them were children.
So last year,
before 7th of October, many children and many people were killed, but specifically I think it was one of the highest on record for children being killed. So life is what you'd expect it to be under occupation. They can raid at any time. They can arrest under administrative detention. So there's no rule, there's no reason why you're being arrested. They can just pick you up and say, well, we're going to keep you until we've decided what to do with you. I have family members who are under administrative detention. They've done nothing. They've absolutely done nothing, but they picked them up in one of these raids and they've taken them away. No information about when you'll be released, why you're being held. And we know that happened wide scale. There was thousands of Palestinian detainees
being
prior
held
to 7th of
hostage.
October. It's exactly that. There's no legal reason for you being held. You're not even allowed communication in many cases with your family to explain what's going on. And in many cases they're mistreated. So we know that currently the situation in these Israeli jails is unbelievably horrific in terms of the number of people being killed and tortured and even raped, as we have recently found out. So the situation was dire.
Traveling between? So you obviously you must have family in different other parts, cousins and whatnot, or just friends. So to travel from one part of the West Bank, area A, to another, or B to another part of the West Bank. How is that like under Israeli military control?
So for a Palestinian there who, unlike us, who holds a British passport, when I travel, you have a little bit of protection with that passport.
So you use the British passport,
when you're crossing into certain areas. But even from a safety perspective, settlers will sometimes throw rocks and stones on some of these main roads as people are traveling between cities. They're sometimes occasionally armed with actual guns. So my cousin who lives in a town in the West Bank called Sarta, he has to travel to a place where he works in Jerusalem. So this is like, one of the Arab administered areas of Jerusalem. And my aunt is always worried what will happen if he travels. What will the settlers attack him? Will something happen to him? So there's absolutely no safety. But obviously when we compare it to the horrific scenes from Gaza, it's incomparable. But it was a constant situation of fear, of not knowing what will happen to your children. Could they be arrested? Could they be attacked? And as we said, what is a crime? To kill 100 people, is that not a crime in the West Bank for no reason? To target children, to target women, to make them search them at checkpoints, to turn you away when you're at a crossing for hours, to make you feel humiliated when you go from one place to another place. It's all part of those tools of occupation and apartheid. But they were happening all the time. Do
not the Palestinians have in the West Bank a police force they could turn to for security against these settler mob attacks?
So unfortunately, the Palestinian police force or the PLO or PA have become like the Arab regimes. That's the only way I can describe them now. So I'll tell you an interesting story. Many of those resistance fighters in the early days before Oslo, they became the original Palestinian kind of security forces. So I have cousins who became essentially members of that Palestinian force. However, they realized this class of people weren't going to play ball in the same way that they needed them to. So they quickly got rid of all of those old kind of resistance fighters turned security forces, because they still had some honor about, this is defending the honor of our people, that we were part of a resistance. We served 10 years, 7 years, 5 years in jails. They were, people who had felt what it meant to be under Israeli occupation. They retrained a whole batch of these new young ones who were unfortunately complete sellouts. to say, just to be very blunt here, they were trained by the US in Jordan and then sent back in. They're as complicit as the Israelis in the crimes that are being committed. To give you just a personal story, one of my dad's great nephews was killed by the PA. He wasn't killed by the Israelis. In this recent incident, after the 7th of October, they raided and shot him, and he was killed by the PA, not by the Israelis.
Wow.
So that's the extent to which, unfortunately, they are complicit in the crime is being undertaken.
Isn't it also a moot point, because does any Palestinian police force have any jurisdiction over the settlers?
None. If they dared to question a settler, God knows what would happen. I'll give you a story. When I was there 5 years ago, you'll always get a few individuals who believe what is happening is a dishonor. So there was one who fired back, and so there's some agreement about when Israelis want to do raids, they have to communicate with the Palestinian security forces. And in one night they were doing one of their raids, and a Palestinian Palestinian Authority security force member fired warning shots. He was immediately arrested the next day by the Palestinian Authority and handed over to the Israelis. This was in Tulkarem. So that's the extent to which they have to behave under Israeli occupation. So he was essentially doing what was within his rights. You've not communicated what you're about to do. You're about to raid like an area B area, whatever it might be. There's supposed to be communication. I'm defending this area. I'm firing a warning shot. The Israelis put a complaint in immediately with the PA. PA handed the man over.
So basically the Palestinian Authority are just an outsourced security force for the Israeli occupation.
Unfortunately.
Of the West Bank.
You may have seen the scenes that erupted at Tulkarem Hospital a couple of weeks ago when they tried to arrest one of the resistance fighters there. And the people came out and they forced the PA security forces out of the hospital. I really can't think of a better example except the Arab armies, the PA. They become, unfortunately, under their current political leadership, a tool for the Zionist occupation.
Okay, that's quite sad. So, after October the 7th, what did Palestinian life become like after? So we know beforehand, before October 7th, the highest record of Palestinian children were killed in that year in West Bank. Man, no Hamas, no Hamas control there. We know that Israeli settlers would raid Palestinian towns and villages, farms, and so on and so forth, with relative immunity. They being armed, and of course in Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank, Palestinians can't have weapons. So it's also basically these thugs with weapons, with guns, come destroy their water tanks, their water cisterns, and so on. We know that obviously you also intimated that there's raids coming in area A and B. It doesn't matter. There's even the so-called autonomous areas. Israel can go into it when and as it sees fit and kill as many people as they see fit. Arbitrary arrests, what's it called? Administrative detention. I've often said also, why don't we put up posters around different capitals around the world, like the Zionists did, to say, have you seen this person? And it's a Palestinian hostage. Held by the Israeli regime, which has not been arrested, which has been arrested for no reason, no charge, nothing, no habeas corpus, no being brought to a judge, being brought with representation, not even accused of anything or charged of anything. So and of course, even just traveling from one area to the other, they have to go through Israeli checkpoints. It doesn't matter if you're about to give birth and you're in an ambulance. I heard in some cases you're stuck at these checkpoints for hours on end. Sometimes it was a 20-minute drive becomes 4 hours, and the Palestinians have to plan for that. They have to say, okay, but with the British passport, you get some leeway. So that was normal life before October the 7th. What was life like for the Palestinians in the West Bank after October the 7th? What does your family, what they told you and what they experienced?
So our family in particular have been badly affected, and that's because Nur Shams has been renamed Little Gaza. It was one of the areas that's been attacked the most viciously in the West Bank.
Wow, subhanAllah.
So there have been dozens and dozens of people murdered in Nur Shams, and they destroyed
by who? By
Israeli
disrespect.
forces.
So that the soldiers
there has been occasional,
even though
this is Israeli forces.
It's not really much of a distinction, but
these are Israeli forces.
Oh, they're actual soldiers shooting people.
Yeah, one of the most shocking scenes that many people actually witnessed was in the first few weeks of the situation in Gaza occurring, they killed a boy with a sniper in Nur Shams. It was a very well-known scene. The child was walking and they killed him with the snipers, and his dad went out to go and rescue him, and his mum and sister were shouting. I don't know if you remember this scene. It did the rounds at the beginning. And as his dad approaches, they shoot him as well. And his dad subsequently dies some months later. But this boy was killed in cold blood. That was right at the beginning of the events that happened after the 7th of October. This is before the major raids and anything like that. That's just the kind of setting the scene of what they were about to do. Since that time, they've gone in, bulldozed the roads.
Bulldozed the roads?
Oh, bulldozed the whole roads.
So bulldozers just came in?
Oh, they just come in and they just completely take up the roads. And what they've been doing now...
In the West Bank? No Hamas there?
No. Jenin is a centre of what is considered resistance, and so is Nur Shams and Tulkarem. These seem to be hotbeds, but there's other areas as well. So because of... At the end of the day, you're not targeting fighters here. You're targeting civilian infrastructure. You're targeting roads, businesses, shops, food, people's homes. So it's a collective punishment of the whole the West Bank.
Collective? So, but is it just the roads, though?
Roads, homes, businesses. I've seen it all. In fact, my cousin showed me a picture of them, CCTV footage of them going into his shop and destroying it. And I can see, and he sent it to me, and you can see the soldier as he's taking out the camera after they've started destroying it. They realize there's a camera. So they come and destroy the camera, and they proceed to destroy the shop.
So what about the infrastructure?
Oh, water supplies have been destroyed, electrical supplies have been destroyed, and then they have to find ways of trying to, fix that and bring those supplies back in. But for a authority that's not already very independent itself, this is a huge difficulty for the people.
I also heard recently that... not recently, sorry. I mean, within this year, Israel withheld the Palestinian Authority's own taxes, prevented them from getting it.
Right,
Norway had to come in and negotiate. Yeah. Why are they even withholding the tax to the Palestinian Authority when what's it got to do with Gaza and Hamas? Right, Palestinian Authority are a separate and antagonistic organization to Hamas. Why are you punishing the West Bank Palestinians? With preventing them even having money to repair those things, right? Yeah. And yet the argument was by the Zionists was they said, Gaza could have been like Singapore, but Hamas instead decided to destroy the infrastructure and or not repair it or not build it and just build tunnels. And it's like, well, I mean, why is not the West Bank like a Singapore? And what happened to that infrastructure? It wasn't because the Palestinians in the West Bank would seem like digging it up to make tunnels for terror attacks. Yeah. Israel's been destroying it, like they've been destroying the Gazan infrastructure. It seems, and after October 7th, they had even more. Seems like they're doing it with not much attention on those areas. Why do you think there's not much attention on what's happening in the West Bank?
To be honest, I feel conflicted here. I actually have made a point a few times not to discuss the West Bank, given the level of atrocities occurring in Gaza. I almost don't want to take away from their suffering because it's incomparable. And while what's happening in the West Bank is a crime in itself, it's a genocide in terms of its intent in itself. I feel to detract from the daily slaughter and destruction of Gaza is almost like, I have to question myself, is this right to shine a light on the West Bank? And I do occasionally, but I almost want the focus to remain on where it's become utterly desperate in Gaza. And there was an interesting point you mentioned about the Singapore. People in Gaza have discussed this point. Could we have made it? But let's ask a question why they did what they did. I mean, I'm not going to go into specifics of 7th of October. Why do they still believe they had a responsibility to Palestine outside of Gaza? And we know that this kind of great march of return that they talked about for the years that the last few years when they used to go to the border.
Yeah, Gazan Palestinians would go in a procession.
That's right.
Towards the big wall around them.
Yeah. And they protested. They had no arms.
They were protest, yeah.
How many people were killed? About 200 were killed by Israeli snipers. Something like 6,000 were wounded. And there's an article in the Haaretz newspaper. Just Google it. 42 kneecaps in one day. Just put that in Google, it comes up.
Yeah.
About an Israeli sniper talking about how he shot 42 kneecaps in one day. This is an abhorrent regime, abhorrent occupation. This is pre-7th of October, as I keep reminding people. They are.
This was
they
when
are
the
killing
Gazans demonstrating peacefully.
Yeah, that's right.
To show their right to return to
that's right.
their villages that they've been destroyed.
That's right.
Yeah.
So Gaza never lost hope in that objective. And what was the whole reason? Because they felt that the world had forgotten Palestine. Because Jerusalem has been attacked how many times in the last few years? The raids on Al-Aqsa in Ramadan, the throwing of stun grenades and arresting individuals as they're praying in Taraweeh and in Ramadan. There's a feeling that, hey, we can't abandon those people. So yes, they could have said, look, let's make a deal. We just forget about the rest of Palestine. We will have to build up our life in Gaza and make it as best as we can. But they didn't abandon the cause. So who are we under our comfortable lives and everything else and the ability to speak out for them are going to say, oh, they should have built Singapore. Ultimately, they didn't want to abandon a much greater cause, which is the occupation and the oppression of people. So Gaza was calling out for the oppression against the West Bank all those years, all those raids. Yes, they couldn't raid Gaza for these last few years, but they were raiding the West Bank. They were killing children there. They were dishonoring women. So, it's the backdrop that we have to understand. This is an occupation that hasn't stopped.
Do you not think it's important, and we'll begin to wrap up here, but do you not think it's important to show what's happening in the West Bank precisely because the West Bank was not involved in October the 7th? It's not controlled by Hamas. And yet see what the Israelis are doing to Palestinians because they're Palestinians. Do you not think then that perhaps an argument could be made?
It is important. I do mention it. I guess for me, it's this moral dilemma of the suffering of Gaza has marked me in a way that I don't think I'll ever recover from, and I think a lot of the world will never recover from. I lost my mother years ago. I don't think I cried a fraction of what I cried for mother for what I've cried for the people of Gaza. The level of destruction, the death that we're seeing of those children, the body parts, the families being torn apart. I just haven't seen anything like that before. And the fact it's streamed to our phones on a daily basis. I mean, once we finish this, I'll be on my phone and it'll be the next massacre and it'll be the next family that's ripped apart. So I agree, the West Bank is important. We should discuss it. I guess for me, it's just the level of horrific crimes that have been committed against the people of Gaza. I want that light to shine on them so that we can rescue them from this occupation.
Sure. I mean, as I said, I do appreciate that. As I said, I think obviously for someone that I've been engaging, obviously Zionist narratives and their arguments has always been where we just defending ourselves against Gaza in particular, Hamas in particular. But what's the argument for West Bank? It shows a more broader animus against the Palestinians.
That's right.
For being Palestinian, for just being there. Even though the Palestinian Authority they officially gave up violence. They said we're peace and we're gonna cooperate with the Israelis, and this is the price the Palestinians are still paying in the West Bank, despite the fact for being denied their independence, or at least denied being left alone by the Israelis, just having peace and security. I want to finish up with a post you wrote. You talked about an Egyptian soldier called Abdullah Ramadan Ashari, and who basically he saw what was happening in Gaza, he saw what was happening to the Gazans, and he reacted obviously by attacking Israeli soldiers. He's a border guard basically, on the border of Gaza. What do you think that says about the feeling amongst many Muslims and soldiers within the Muslim world, like the people within the Muslim world? What do you think that tells us about the general feeling amongst the people in the Muslim world watching this massacre, including those who are involved in power structures, in the military end of those power structures, or who probably signed up to the military in a belief of defending life, defending the honor and dignity of their fellow brothers and sisters, and then seeing these things. What do you think that tells us about this, just the general sentiments anyway?
Yeah, I think this is a crucial question. So when I wrote that post, I recall that it was the day after there was a massacre in Rafah, and that was where that whole social media trend, all eyes on Rafah, came up. And actually, that news transpired the day later that a small unit of Egyptian soldiers, it looks like they engaged with an Israeli with the Israeli forces. We don't know the full story because I think there's a complete blackout on both ends, on the Egyptian and the Israeli end. But it sounds like some kind of armed, there was some kind of shootout between them. And we know that one soldier was martyred, another one was martyred soon after. For me, that just showed the level of concern that the armed forces have for the issue of Gaza. And soon after that, there was an interesting article that was published in Middle East Eye about interviews that they conducted with many soldiers in the Egyptian army who said they were extremely frustrated that Gaza is right next to them and they can't do anything to help the people there. And we know there are similar stories that have come out from many countries. In Jordan, you do hear stories of Jordanians who talk with this passion that where are the armed forces? Why have they responded? The example of Duwairi. I've had many interactions with retired generals where they've said the same thing. Unfortunately, the whole power structure of the armed forces sits under the current political system. And they are not permitted in any way to assist the people of Palestine. And for someone to do that, they would be acting in isolation, essentially, of the armed forces. And we talked about that. You've got no supply lines. You could easily be isolated. You could be arrested. So that they probably know, with the best will in the world, with the intention to try and help the people of Gaza, they need the armed forces en masse to take a political decision to move. So I think we're in a very difficult position where it looks like nothing is happening. But I would give you the example of Bangladesh. If I said 3 weeks ago, how secure is Hasina? You'd say to me, she's absolutely secure. Nothing's happened. Some demonstrations and protests by these young students who weren't aligned to any political groups, which was really interesting, set in motion a series of events which led to her running away to India only 2.5 weeks later. What was crucial in that is the armed forces also pulled their support, and they said, we're no longer going to defend Hasina. And there's some historical context to that, what happened in 2009 between the Bangladeshi officers and Hasina. But the point is, if you had assessed the situation 3 weeks ago, you'd have told me, no way, Hasina's safe. And Sisi looks safe now, and Abdullah looks safe now, and MBS looks safe now, because that's what is apparent. But it only needs a change in the political situation, in potentially officers making the right moves, and these people could be consigned to the dustbin of history. That's what I believe. But ultimately, we have to have a bigger vision. The vision can't be just armed conflict for the sake of armed conflict. Why is Palestine in the mess it's in? Nationalism, disunity, a lack of Islamic leadership. You have those things, and Jordan no longer becomes about Jordan. I was in Jordan actually in April, May, and one of the most frustrating things for me was this Jordanian argument. They kept saying, we have to worry about Jordan. I said, what do you mean we have to worry about Jordan? Are we Muslim? Do we see the land divided because of a line in the sand? So if Irbid is attacked tomorrow, we should respond. But Irbid is just a few miles in Jordan. It could have been the other way. That deserves the response and the might of the Jordanian army. And there was one post I remember doing in Jordan. I was sitting in the passport office doing a renewal for my dad and stepmom. And they have this image, horrible image, Sharif of Mecca and his progeny. And it says, Irfa rasak into Urdani. Raise your head high, you're Jordanian. I thought, subhanallah, everything is wrong in that statement. First of all, you've not raised your head.
He started out not in Jordan. He wasn't in Jordan.
He wasn't even in Jordan.
He comes from
it's just made up.
West Arabia.
Nationalism is a made up concept that makes people feel affinity to a piece of land. Islam is way higher. It's superior. It's values. It's me and you because we believe in the same creator. It's me and you because we believe in the same Quran and the same messenger. Islam came to eradicate that. وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا. Hold tight to the rope of Allah together. Destroy the concept of racism. Yeah, do not divide amongst yourselves.
It seems like nationalism
is the cause of this problem.
Breaks the ummah down into smaller ummahs and say, no, this is your ummah. Your ummah is these borders decided by a Frenchman and an Englishman, Sykes and Picot, probably over a glass of brandy. That's your new ummah, only within this geographical location. Everyone else is not your ummah, and so on. So, this would indicate that really, I think that the real occupation, I think that affects the Muslims, the worst one, and it's also parallels an article you wrote about saying that the worst enemies or the real enemies are not so much this Israeli occupation, which are just doing their own nationalism and coming in from Europe. It is these rulers and the ideas that were forced upon us in colonialism that makes us see the rest of the Ummah as being another Ummah from ourselves. And that Islam is no longer good enough to be the ruling system or the national interest of the Muslims. Because if Islam was our national interest, we'd be approaching these things very differently. We'd see it like Salahuddin Ayyubi, like Sultan Baybars and so on, how they dealt with a similar occupation in a similar location, in the same location.
Yeah, exactly.
All that time ago. So this is, I think, food for thought for us to go back to our deen for solutions.
Yeah.
And I think, as Omar Rada Anhum, your namesake, said that if we seek izzah from anything else other than Islam, Allah will make this a cause of humiliation upon us.
Right, absolutely.
And because we've been avoiding the implementation of Islam and to you don't have to be a perfect Muslim, but just want to do it, just have that desire to do it. That we will be continually humiliated unless we actually seek the izzah through the deen of Islam. So on that note, barakallahu feekum for you coming on and ask these questions, and inshallah I think this is a lot for us all to reflect on and hopefully be inspired for future thinking and looking at how we can solve our problems.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much.